right? So what ends up happening these kiddos is they get stuck in sympathetic overdrive. What happens though is when you have birth trauma, this leads to that process. And what it'll do is it makes it harder for their nervous system to get out of that sympathetic stimulus or drive. And even life is being overstimulated and there's a lot more impact coming on there. That is going to keep them in that state. And then their brain adapts so fast that they pattern themselves into that way quickly. That is where mouth breathing keeps a child also in a fight or flight state, because as they're stuck in that sympathetic dominance, and I've seen it with kids as soon as they were born, even 2 to 4 week olds, when we see them after their body has processed through a little bit, been out in the world a little bit. This will lead to potential mouth breathing and weak tongue. We call it low tone in the nervous system, and low tone can lead to weaknesses in certain areas of the body of muscles and tone, like core, important things, important factors. And one of them is tongue. And what happens in this process, and I want to really emphasize this is why you can try to work the tongue all day long, strengthen and do all those things. But if you have sympathetic overdrive, sympathetic dominance, a gas pedal revving, what ends up happening is you become more of a mouth breather now. Remember I said the brain goes to quantity rather than quality. And so now it's going to breathe in as much air as it possibly can. And what will happen is you're stimulating more of that sympathetic nervous system. So it becomes a snowball effect, and you just keep doing it over and over and over. And you're firing up that fight or flight state. And this becomes even like I said, the brain knows this, but the brain has to do its best for the body every single time. This then can potentially lead to the sleep ADHD link. There's a link about this that they've been looking at, and they looked at fragmented sleep leads to the prefrontal cortex dysfunctioning. So that will mimic ADHD. Doesn't mean they have it. I'm not a component to say someone has ADHD. I don't like that label. I never had that label given to me, but as I learned all the symptoms and everything, I was definitely that kid. But what I really realized is I had probably more prefrontal cortex dysfunction. Now, you may say, what is that? That's the brain, part of your brain right behind your forehead. It's critical. This is what I work on. This is what all chiropractors work on, especially ones that are very specific. We address this. We work at the prefrontal cortex. It allows us to create impulse control and helps us to stay more centered and calm. It allows us to do future planning, executive functions of it. It lowers our stress levels and so much more. And so imagine that for a kid, building that up and having a really strong foundation to a prefrontal cortex. This is why one of the many reasons why I recommend wellness, long lifestyle care when it comes to chiropractic, because from a neurological perspective. The third thing then that this leads to is sensory processing issues, because you're going to have, with a restricted airway, there creates disorganized nervous system now. They can't get that proper oxygen. So now things are heightened a little bit more. When your sympathetic nervous system's more on overdrive, you become way more sensitive to stimulus. And this is where it kind of leads to that, sleep issue, which can lead to the prefrontal cortex dysfunction, which mimics ADHD. Well, the sensory processing issue now comes in because now your kid's a little easily overstimulated from the little stimulus, or they go from 0 to 100 and they're just constantly revved. This is where now the nervous system, think about when you're in a very stressed state, imagine you have an argument with your partner, right? Your spouse, and you're aggravated. Would you say that you react a lot easier in that state than you do being calm and relaxed? We're all going to say yes to that. I'm even a component of that. That's the sympathetic nervous system. It heightens our senses, so it makes it easier to react. We're in a survival state. And that's what we see a lot more with kiddos and the effect of that. The other part that we'll see, and I mentioned this earlier, is the immune side, right? So when you have less nasal infiltration, you have you have something called your innate immune system. And it's a non-specific, which means that it'll throw everything in the world at it to take care of it. If we're breathing more through the nose, we have that line of defense that's strong. If we don't, it's weakened. And this is where, like I said, it can lead to then, as it's getting more into the throat and stressing this area more, tonsillitis or just enlarged tonsils, and also more chronic ear infections. This is where this process comes. So I call this neurologic cascade, which leads to, sympathetic drive, gas pedal, right? Revving, sleep ADHD, sensory processing, and the immune issue. My concern about the sympathetic overdrive is that the brain will eventually adapt to think this is life and how it has to adapt to. And then there's more work we got to do to break that cycle and pattern down, because it affects brain development. And this is one other thing I see why kids have so many reflexes that are still turned on, maybe primitive or posture. And if you don't know what those are, we have talked about those in the podcast, and you can check those out where I break those down a little bit more. So what are the things that I will look at as a pediatric chiropractor, trained more neurologically focused, to